The strawberries and cream were being served when the screaming began. It was not the sort of scream one might expect from a woman who had encountered a spider in the garden, or discovered that a cherished rose had been trampled. It was something far more primitive, a sound of genuine terror that seemed to originate from inside the house itself. For a moment, the assembled guests froze, their teacups suspended halfway to their mouths, their conversations dying mid-sentence, as though someone had drawn a curtain across the afternoon. Then came another scream, this one more urgent and unmistakably the voice of Lady Thornton's lady's maid, young Rosie, who had been inside preparing the drawing room for the later stages of the party. Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care, noting as she did that Eleanor Hartley's hand had gone quite still, the strawberry she had been about to eat forgotten on her plate, while Caroline Thornton had risen from her chair with such suddenness that she nearly toppled it. Richard himself had taken 3 quick steps toward the house before seeming to check himself, as though remembering that he ought to maintain some semblance of composure. The doctor was already moving, his professional instincts overriding social propriety, and the magistrate was calling out for someone to fetch the police constable from the village. Miss Marple, however, remained seated, her hands folded in her lap, watching the reactions of each person present with the calm observation of someone who understood that the most revealing moments in human behavior often came not during the crisis itself, but in those few seconds immediately preceding action. By the time everyone had crowded into the house, following the maid's cries to the library, it became apparent that whatever had prompted the screaming had not resulted in any immediately visible catastrophe. The library appeared undisturbed. The books were in their places, the furniture arranged as it always was, and there was no sign of intrusion or disturbance. But it was the sight of Gerald Whitmore, the retired colonel who lived in the house next to Meadowbrook and who had been a close friend of Lord Thornton's in his lifetime, slumped in the leather wing chair near the window, that explained Rosie's terror. Gerald was quite dead, his head tilted back at an unnatural angle, his mouth slack, and his right hand still clutching a tumbler of what appeared to be whiskey. There was no obvious wound, no sign of violence, and his expression was almost peaceful, as though he had simply fallen asleep. Yet something about the tableau suggested that the peace was the peace of finality rather than rest. The doctor knelt beside the body, checking for a pulse with practiced efficiency before looking up and shaking his head. He rose to his feet with the gravity that doctors always adopted when delivering confirmation of death and began issuing instructions that no one touch anything, that someone telephone for the police, that everyone return to the garden and remain there until the authorities arrived. But it was Miss Marple who noticed what the others had not. There, on the small table beside the wing chair, where Gerald had been sitting, stood 2 glasses, both containing what appeared to be whiskey, and between them lay that same white envelope that Eleanor Hartley had placed in Richard Thornton's pocket not more than 20 minutes earlier. The envelope was now open, and a single sheet of white paper protruded from it, though the contents were too far away for Miss Marple to read. As the guests were herded back out into the garden, where the strawberries and cream were rapidly being cleared away by nervous servants, Miss Marple made a quiet observation to Margaret Hartley, who had moved to stand beside her with the flushed expression of someone caught between shock and something rather more complicated. "It appears that Mr. Whitmore has had a rather sudden change in his plans for the afternoon," Miss Marple said gently, her eyes never leaving Margaret's face. Margaret's response was immediate and somewhat too vehement. "I hardly knew the man. Eleanor mentioned meeting him once or twice, I believe, but we were certainly not intimates." The very specificity of the denial, Miss Marple reflected, was itself revealing. No one had suggested any particular relationship between Margaret Hartley and Gerald Whitmore, yet Margaret had felt compelled to establish the absence of one. This was precisely the sort of automatic defensive reaction that suggested the existence of something that Margaret had wished to conceal. Within the hour, the local constabulary had arrived, led by Inspector Graves, a competent enough man of some 50 years who had spent most of his career dealing with minor infractions and village disputes, rather than serious crime. He secured the library and began his preliminary interviews with the guests, focusing his attention primarily on those who had been closest to Gerald Whitmore or who had been observed near the library during the relevant time period. The consensus that emerged was that Gerald had been perfectly well when the party began, had taken a glass of whiskey from the garden bar around 3 o'clock, and had subsequently retired into the house, presumably to escape the heat and the noise. No one had seen him between then and the moment Rosie had discovered him dead. As the afternoon faded into evening and the guests were finally permitted to depart, Miss Marple remained in the drawing room with Lady Thornton, offering what comfort an elderly spinster from the village could provide to a woman whose garden party had been so spectacularly interrupted. It was then that she made the observation that would, in the fullness of time, prove to be the key that would unlock the entire mystery. "It's curious," she said thoughtfully, as Lady Thornton poured herself a brandy with slightly shaking hands, "that a man of Mr. Whitmore's generation would accept a drink from someone he had only recently met. Gentlemen of his era were always so particular about such things, weren't they? One thinks of them as being rather cautious about accepting hospitality from those not in their established circle." Lady Thornton looked up from her brandy, her eyes momentarily unfocused, as though she were trying to piece together a puzzle that had suddenly become more complex than she had previously imagined. "I'm not entirely certain whom Mr. Whitmore had accepted a drink from," she said slowly. "He was in the garden for most of the afternoon, and there were so many people circulating with trays. He could have taken it from any of the servants or from one of the guests." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, but she was already constructing a different picture of events in her mind, one that suggested that Gerald Whitmore had not accepted a drink from a servant bearing a tray, but rather had been invited into the library specifically for a private conversation with someone he knew well enough to trust. This supposition was confirmed the following morning when Inspector Graves called upon Miss Marple at her cottage, a small stone structure with a garden that was the envy of half the village, to request her observations regarding the events of the previous day. The inspector was not a man given to soliciting the opinions of elderly spinsters, but he had been in Little Ashford long enough to understand that Miss Marple possessed an almost uncanny ability to notice things that others overlooked, and in a case where the preliminary autopsy had suggested that Gerald Whitmore had been poisoned, most likely with cyanide, administered in his whiskey, he was willing to set aside his professional pride and listen to what the village's most observant resident might have to say. Miss Marple offered him tea, which he accepted with the weariness of a man who had already been awake since before dawn, and as they sat in her small parlour with its faded chintz furniture and its walls lined with books, she began to lay out her observations with the same gentle precision she might have used in describing a particularly intricate knitting pattern. First, she noted, there was the matter of the white envelope that had been found in the library, which had contained a letter written in what appeared to be Eleanor Hartley's handwriting. The letter, though Miss Marple had not been permitted to read it in its entirety, seemed to be some form of ultimatum or demand, the specific contents of which the inspector had not yet disclosed. Second, there was the curious fact that Gerald Whitmore's body had been discovered in the library rather than in the garden, which suggested that someone had deliberately enticed him away from the party, away from witnesses, and into a place where a private conversation could occur without observation. Third, and perhaps most significantly, there was the matter of the 2 glasses that had been found beside Gerald's body, glasses which suggested that whoever had poisoned Gerald Whitmore had intended to share the poisoned drink with him, implying either an act of joint suicide or, more likely, an act of murder staged to appear as though it might have been murder-suicide. Miss Marple paused in her recitation to take a sip of her own tea, observing over the rim of her cup the way the inspector's expression had shifted from skeptical to attentive. The person who poisoned Mr. Whitmore, Miss Marple, he continued, would have had access to cyanide, which narrows the field considerably. It is not a substance one simply has lying about the house, and yet it is also not so rare that its possession would be immediately suspicious. A chemist might have it, a gardener might have it, for pest control, a photographer might have it, for developing chemicals. But more significantly, the person who did this would have had to know that Mr. Whitmore would accept an invitation to the library from them, which suggests either a relationship of long-standing and trust, or a relationship of such recent intensity that Mr. Whitmore might have been willing to take risks he would not ordinarily take. She set down her teacup with deliberate care. "The question that occupied my thoughts throughout the night," Miss Marple said, "is not really who poisoned Mr. Whitmore, but rather why someone would go to such lengths to commit murder at a garden party, in broad daylight, with 40 witnesses scattered across the grounds. The answer, I suspect, is that the murder was not the primary objective at all. The murder was, in a sense, a distraction, a means of drawing attention to something else, or perhaps of silencing someone who represented a threat to someone else's plans." The inspector leaned forward, his teacup forgotten on the small table beside his chair. "You believe the murder and the letter are connected?" "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that the letter was the catalyst, yes. Someone wrote to Mr. Whitmore, or more accurately, someone placed that letter in Mr. Whitmore's possession, knowing that it would prompt him to seek a private conversation with the person they wished to implicate in the crime. That person accepted the invitation to the library, and while there, ensured that both glasses were poisoned rather than allowing Mr. Whitmore to be the only casualty. But then, and is the truly clever part, that person chose not to drink from their glass, instead leaving the library and returning to the party as though nothing had occurred." The inspector's face had gone quite pale. "You're suggesting that someone deliberately framed another person for murder?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple corrected gently, "that someone has orchestrated a murder in such a way as to appear random and impulsive, when in fact it was calculated and precise. And the person who orchestrated it was someone who understood human nature well enough to predict how each of the principal players would react to a crisis. That person is still among us, Inspector, and unless I am very much mistaken, they are already putting the next phase of their plan into motion." Inspector Graves remained at Miss Marple's cottage for another hour, during which time Miss Marple walked him through the events of the garden party, with the meticulous attention to detail that had made her such an invaluable source of information over the years. She described the movements of each principal player, the timing of conversations, the brief absences that had punctuated the afternoon, and most importantly, the subtle shifts in demeanor that had occurred when news of Gerald Whitmore's death had spread through the assembled guests. She noted that Richard Thornton had immediately moved toward the house with the reflexive action of someone whose instinct was to control a situation, yet had then checked himself, suggesting that he was conscious of how such an action might be perceived by observers. She observed that Caroline Thornton's anxiety, which had been evident before the murder, had transformed into something quite different. Not relief, precisely, but rather a kind of grim resignation, as though a crisis she had been dreading had finally arrived and she was prepared to face its consequences. And Enor Hartley, Miss Marple noted with particular emphasis, had displayed an absence of shock that was itself remarkable. Most innocent people, when confronted with sudden death, experience at least a momentary loss of composure. Eleanor had grown very still, yes, and her face had paled slightly, but there had been no gasp of surprise, no exclamation of disbelief, no frantic questioning. Instead, there had been a kind of watchfulness in her grey-green eyes, as though she had been waiting for something, and it had finally come to pass. After the inspector had departed, promising to pursue the forensic analysis of the two glasses and to interview each guest more thoroughly, Miss Marple spent the remainder of the morning in her garden, ostensibly tending to her roses, but in fact engaged in the more serious business of constructing a timeline of events that made logical sense. She had learned long ago that murders were rarely the work of sudden passion or opportunity. They were almost always the result of careful planning, even when they appeared spontaneous. Someone in Little Ashford had wanted Gerald Whitmore dead, and that someone had possessed both the knowledge and the access to procure cyanide. More importantly, that someone had known that a garden party at Meadowbrook Hall would provide the perfect cover for the act. A large gathering, multiple servants, numerous guests, and the kind of social disorder that made it possible for someone to slip away unnoticed. By lunchtime, Miss Marple had received a visitor, Margaret Hartley, Eleanor's mother, who arrived at the cottage with the appearance of a woman who was struggling to maintain her composure in the face of mounting pressure. Margaret was a tall woman with iron-grey hair and the kind of face that suggested she had spent most of her life pursing her lips in disapproval of one thing or another. She accepted Miss Marple E's offer of tea with a kind of desperate gratitude and seated herself on the edge of the chintz sofa as though she feared it might collapse beneath her. "I've come to speak with you," Margaret began without preamble, "because I believe you have deduced certain things about my daughter that the inspector has not yet grasped, and I think it's important that someone who understands the complexities of village life should know the truth before the authorities arrive at their own conclusions." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and waited, a posture that had encouraged countless confessions over the years. Margaret took a deep breath. "Eleanor did not come to Little Ashford by accident," she said quietly. "We moved here deliberately because we learned that Richard Thornton would be spending the summer at Meadowbrook Hall." Eleanor had known Richard years ago, in London, before he married Caroline. They were very much involved with one another, though of course it was never publicly acknowledged. When Richard married Caroline, Eleanor was devastated, though she attempted to conceal it. "I had hoped that she would move on with her life, but the truth is that she has never stopped thinking about him." Miss Marple's expression remained neutral, but her mind was already racing ahead, constructing new possibilities from this revelation. "And the letter that was found in the library?" she asked gently. "The letter that Eleanor placed in Mr. Whitmore's pocket?" Margaret's face crumpled slightly. "I don't know what letter you're referring to," she said, but the quaver in her voice suggested otherwise. "Eleanor has been foolish, certainly, in her attempts to renew her acquaintance with Richard, but I cannot believe she would be capable of harming anyone. Whatever Richard may have done, whatever pain he may have caused, Eleanor is not a murderer. Yet even as Garrett spoke these words, Miss Marple detected something in her tone that suggested uncertainty, a mother's hope, warring against a mother's knowledge of her child's capabilities. After Margaret had departed, leaving her tea untouched, Miss Marple sat for a long time in her garden, watching the sparrows as they hopped among the flower beds searching for insects. The case, she reflected, was becoming increasingly complex, which paradoxically meant that it was also becoming clearer. The murder of Gerald Whitmore had been intended to accomplish something specific, and the letter that Eleanor had written, for it almost certainly was Eleanor's letter, had been the instrument that had set events in motion. But Gerald Whitmore would not have accepted a private meeting in the library with Eleanor Hartley unless there was something in that letter that had prompted him to do so. What, then, had Eleanor written that was so significant that it had drawn Gerald away from the party and into a place where poison could be administered? And more troubling still, if Eleanor had placed the letter in Richard's pocket rather than giving it directly to Gerald, how had it subsequently come to be in Gerald's possession? The answer to that question, Miss Marple suspected, would reveal not merely the identity of the murderer, but the true motive that lay beneath the surface of the crime, a motive that was likely far more sinister and far-reaching than the simple crime of passion that the inspector had begun to construct in his preliminary investigations. The answer came unexpectedly from the village post office, where Miss Marple had occasion to purchase stamps the following afternoon. Mrs. Pemberton, who had operated the post office for 30 years and possessed an almost encyclopedic knowledge of the village's correspondence, was sorting through the morning's deliveries when Miss Marple arrived. In the course of their conversation about the weather and the shocking events at Meadowbrook Hall, Mrs. Pemberton casually mentioned that she had processed an unusual number of letters between Eleanor Hartley and someone in London over the past few months, letters that had arrived with considerable regularity and had borne the postmark of a legal firm. This information, seemingly innocuous to Mrs. Pemberton, struck Miss Marple with the force of a revelation. A legal firm suggested lawyers, and lawyers were engaged for matters of law, inheritance disputes, contracts, the division of property, the settlement of estates. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Pemberton with her usual courtesy and departed the post office with her mind already constructing a new framework for understanding the events that had culminated in Gerald Whitmore's death. That evening, she called upon Inspector Graves at the police station and requested that he investigate whether Eleanor Hartley or her mother had any legal claim on Gerald Whitmore's estate. The inspector, initially skeptical, agreed to make inquiries, and by the following morning had returned to Miss Marple's cottage with information that fundamentally altered the investigation. Gerald Whitmore, it transpired, had been considerably wealthier than anyone in Little Ashford had realized. His estate, valued at approximately £200,000, was to be divided among several charitable organizations and a few distant cousins, with one significant exception. According to a will that had been drawn up 15 years earlier, a substantial portion of the estate, approximately £50,000, was to go to Eleanor Hartley upon her 30th birthday, which would have occurred in precisely 3 months' time. This provision had been made when Eleanor was still a child, and Gerald had been, in his capacity as a trustee of her late father's estate, responsible for ensuring her welfare. The inspector stared at Miss Marple across her parlour table with the expression of a man who had suddenly realized he had been looking at the case from entirely the wrong angle. "But how would Eleanor have known about this provision?" he demanded. "I've just discovered it myself through the solicitor, and the will has been kept confidential." "Because," Miss Marple said quietly, "someone told her. Someone who had reason to know of Gerald's financial arrangements and who had motive to ensure that Eleanor would attempt to contact him, to meet with him privately, and to place herself in a position where she could be implicated in his death." The inspector's face darkened with comprehension. "Richard Thornton," he said. "He's been manipulating Eleanor all along, using her infatuation with him to—" But Miss Marple held up a hand, her expression troubled. "It's somewhat more complicated than that, I'm afraid," she said. "Yes, Richard Thornton has been manipulative, and yes, he appears to have encouraged Eleanor's belief that they might resume their former relationship. But I don't believe he is the one who poisoned Gerald Whitmore. Rather, I suspect that Richard Thornton is the unwitting instrument through which someone else has accomplished this murder." The inspector leaned back in his chair, his patience clearly wearing thin. "Then who, Miss Marple? If not Thornton, and apparently not Eleanor, then who has both motive and opportunity?" Miss Marple rose from her chair and walked to the window, where she could see her garden bathed in the soft light of late afternoon. "I believe," she said slowly, "that we must examine the situation from the perspective of someone whose position in society depends upon maintaining a carefully constructed facade, someone who has much to lose should certain secrets come to light, someone who has on watching Richard Thornton's infidelities and Eleanor Hartley's attempts to seduce him with the kind of careful observation that comes from having already endured betrayal once before." She turned to face the inspector directly. "I believe, Inspector Graves, that Caroline Thornton has orchestrated this entire affair. She has encouraged the connection between Richard and Eleanor, observed their interactions, and determined that Eleanor would be the perfect instrument through which to accomplish the murder of Gerald Whitmore, not because Gerald himself posed a threat to Caroline, but because his death, and Eleanor's implication in that death, would effectively remove Eleanor from Richard's reach and restore domestic tranquility to the Thornton household. Caroline would have known about the inheritance. Perhaps Richard mentioned it in passing, or perhaps she discovered it through other means. She would have ensured that Eleanor learned of the inheritance as well, knowing that Eleanor would be unable to resist the temptation to contact Gerald and attempt to arrange a private meeting. The inspector's face had gone quite pale. "But the letter, Miss Marple. Eleanor's letter was found in the library with Eleanor's handwriting." "Eleanor's handwriting, yes," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "but that does not necessarily mean that Eleanor wrote it." "A clever woman, Inspector, and Caroline Thornton is nothing if not clever, might have studied her rival's penmanship and reproduced it with sufficient accuracy to fool a casual observer. The letter was written to entice Gerald into the library, to separate him from the protection of witnesses, and to position him as the victim of a crime that would appear to be either a murder-suicide or the work of a desperate young woman attempting to secure her inheritance through violent means." She resumed her seat, her aged hands folded serenelle in her lap. "What we must now determine," Miss Marple concluded, "is how Caroline Thornton obtained the cyanide, and whether she had an accomplice, which I suspect she did, though the identity of that accomplice may prove to be the most shocking revelation of all." The investigation took a decisive turn when Inspector Graves, armed with Miss Marple's theory, obtained a warrant to search the Thornton residence in London and discovered a small vial of cyanide hidden in Caroline's dressing room, concealed within a hollowed-out copy of a book on floral arrangement. The discovery, combined with the forensic analysis of the handwriting on the letter found in the library, which experts now determined had been carefully forged rather than naturally written, provided the inspector with sufficient evidence to bring Caroline Thornton in for formal questioning. What neither the inspector nor initially Miss Marple had anticipated was the confession that would emerge from that interrogation, a confession that revealed layers of deception and manipulation far more intricate than anyone had previously imagined. Caroline Thornton, when confronted with the evidence against her, did not attempt to deny her guilt. Instead, she sat in the police station's austere interview room and calmly explained the circumstances that had driven her to commit murder. She had known about Richard's affair with Eleanor Hartley before they moved to Little Ashford. Richard, in his careless way, had mentioned the name of the village where Eleanor had taken a teaching position, and Caroline had made it her business to discover the connection. She had watched as her husband had become increasingly infatuated with the younger woman, and she had felt the slow erosion of her position in society, that delicate balance of respectability and influence that she had carefully cultivated over 2 decades of marriage. What had finally driven her to action, however, was not Richard's infidelity. Caroline had long since accepted that as an inevitable consequence of marriage to a man of his temperament, but rather the discovery that Richard was contemplating leaving her. She had intercepted a letter from his solicitor outlining the terms of a potential divorce settlement, and the figures cited had made it clear that Richard intended to minimize her financial security while maximizing his freedom. In desperation, Caroline had conceived a plan that would accomplish 2 objectives simultaneously. It would eliminate Gerald Whitmore, who had begun to express concerns about Richard's character and who had hinted that he might not support Richard's desired divorce settlement, and it would simultaneously remove Eleanor from Richard's life by implicating her in Gerald's death. But Caroline's confession, while seemingly complete, contained one element that troubled Miss Marple deeply when she reviewed the details with Inspector Graves. Caroline had stated that she had forged Eleanor's handwriting after studying the young woman's correspondence, but there was a practical problem with this assertion. Caroline had not had access to samples of Eleanor's handwriting until after she had already conceived the plan to murder Gerald. The only way Caroline could have obtained such samples would have been through correspondence that Eleanor had sent to someone in Little Ashford, presumably Margaret Hartley, or through some other intermediary. This discrepancy gnawed at Miss Marple throughout the night, and by the following morning she had determined that there was indeed an accomplice, and that accomplice was someone who had provided Caroline with the means to forge Eleanor's handwriting, and who had, most critically, ensured that the forged letter would be placed in Gerald's possession at precisely the right moment. The accomplice, Miss Marple suspected, was Richard Thornton himself, not as a willing co-conspirator in the murder, but as someone who had been manipulated by his wife into providing the assistance she required without fully understanding the consequences of his actions. Miss Marple requested a private meeting with Richard Thornton, which took place in Lady Thornton's drawing room at Meadowbrook Hall. Richard entered the room with the air of a man who had begun to understand the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen his carefully constructed life, and he took a seat across from Miss Marple with the weariness of someone bearing an unbearable weight. "You've realized that your wife manipulated you," Miss Marple said, without preamble. It was not a question. Richard's face crumpled, and he nodded slowly. "I provided her with samples of Eleanor's handwriting," he said quietly. "Caroline asked me to do so, claiming she wished to invite Eleanor to a gathering and wanted to match the handwriting style for some foolish reason I no longer remember. I thought it was merely one of her quirks. I had no idea she intended to use them for this." He buried his face in his hands. "I gave her the forged letter to deliver to Gerald, claiming it was from Eleanor, and that it contained a request for a private meeting. I told Gerald that Eleanor was in some kind of financial difficulty and needed his advice. He agreed to meet with her in the library, and I told Caroline exactly when and where this would occur. I thought Eleanor would be embarrassed, that Richard would see through her deception, that the entire affair would implode and he would turn his attentions elsewhere. I never imagined that Caroline intended to poison him. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her aged eyes fixed on Richard's face with an intensity that seemed to penetrate his defenses. "And did your wife tell you what she intended to do?" "She told me afterward," Richard said, his voice hollow. "After Gerald was found dead, she came to me and explained everything. She said she had done it for us, to protect our marriage, to ensure that we could remain together without the complications that Eleanor and Gerald represented. She said that Eleanor would be blamed, that I would be free of my infatuation, and that we could begin again." He looked up at Miss Marple with eyes that had aged years in the course of a single day. "I knew then that I was married to someone capable of murder, Miss Marple, and I knew that I had, through my weakness and my foolishness, made that murder possible. I went to the police this morning and told them everything. I have no excuse to offer, and I deserve whatever punishment the law sees fit to impose upon me. Eleanor Hartley, when she learned that she was no longer under suspicion and that the true architect of Gerald Whitmore's death was Caroline Thornton, experienced a transformation of emotion that was almost violent in its intensity. She came to Miss Marple's cottage on a grey afternoon when the sky hung low and heavy with the promise of rain, and she sat in the parlour with her hands trembling slightly as she attempted to process the revelation that the man she had believed she loved had been, in the final analysis, little more than a tool in his wife's hands. "I feel such a fool," Eleanor said bitterly. "I see now how carefully I was being observed, how my own feelings were being used against me. Richard never cared for me at all. He was merely playing a role, performing a part in a drama that his wife had already written. Miss Marple, who had learned over the decades that sympathy was often less useful than understanding, regarded Eleanor with neither judgment nor pity. "You were not a fool," she said gently. "You were a young woman who possessed considerable intelligence and feeling, placed in proximity to a man who had once meant something to you. Caroline Thornton was counting on precisely those qualities. She understood that you would be willing to take risks for Richard that you would never take for anyone else, and she orchestrated events to ensure that those risks would lead directly to your incrimination." She paused, allowing Eleanor a moment to absorb this truth. "But there is something that troubles me still," Miss Marple continued, "and I wonder if you might be able to clarify it. When you placed the envelope in Richard's pocket at the garden party, what precisely did it contain?" Eleanor's face flushed with embarrassment and shame. "It was a letter," she admitted. "A letter expressing my feelings for him and asking him to consider leaving Caroline. I intended for him to read it privately and respond to me. I was foolish and desperate, and She broke off, unable to continue. "But you did not write that letter that was found in the library," Miss Marple said. "The letter that Gerald Whitmore received was a forgery, written in an approximation of your handwriting but not actually penned by you. This means that Caroline Thornton must have intercepted your letter to Richard, read its contents, and determined that it provided her with the perfect instrument for her plan." Eleanor stared at Miss Marple in horror as the full implications of this revelation became clear to her. Caroline had not merely stolen her letter, she had used Eleanor's own desperate emotions as the foundation upon which to construct an entire framework of deception. The letter that Eleanor had written to Richard, expressing her longing for him and her belief that he might leave his wife, had been transformed by Caroline into a letter from Eleanor to Gerald, requesting a private meeting under false pretenses. In doing so, Caroline had turned Eleanor's own passion into the very mechanism of her potential destruction. "She is truly evil," Eleanor whispered. "Not mad, not acting in the heat of passion, but calculating and deliberately cruel." Miss Marple did not contradict her, though she might have offered the observation that evil was often simply the result of wounded pride and desperate circumstances taken to their logical extreme. Instead, she asked Eleanor a question that had been forming in her mind since the discovery of Richard's confession. "Tell me, Eleanor, when you first came to Little Ashford, did you contact Richard directly, or did you allow him to discover your presence gradually?" Eleanor hesitated before answering. "I did neither, actually," she said. "My mother suggested that we move here. She said it would be good for my career, that the village school was in need of an art teacher, and that the village itself was charming and quiet. I had no intention of contacting Richard. I had accepted that he was married and that chapter of my life was closed. But then, by what seemed like coincidence, he arrived at Meadowbrook Hall for the summer, and we encountered each other quite by accident at the village market. He seemed pleased to see me, and from that point forward, he began to engineer opportunities for us to speak privately. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place in Miss Marple's mind with an almost audible click. She rose from her chair and walked to the window, where she could see the grey afternoon light beginning to fade toward evening. "Your mother," she said quietly, "knew that Richard would be at Meadowbrook Hall." She knew this because she had discovered it through her own investigation, just as Caroline Thornton had discovered Eleanor's location in London. Margaret Hartley moved to Little Ashford not by chance, but by design, with the intention of facilitating a reunion between her daughter and the man she believed had wronged her years before. Eleanor made a small sound of protest. "My mother would never. She has always had my best interests at heart," but her voice lacked conviction, and Miss Marple could see in the younger woman's face the dawning recognition that those closest to us are often the most capable of manipulating our emotions for their own purposes. "Your mother," Miss Marple said gently but firmly, "believed that you had suffered because of Richard Thornton's marriage to Caroline. She wanted to restore to you what she perceived you had lost. In doing so, she created the conditions that allowed Caroline to engineer her murder. This does not make Margaret Hartley responsible for Gerald Whitmore's death, but it does mean that she bears some culpability for the circumstances that made his death possible. She must live with that knowledge, as must we all." Eleanor left the cottage as the rain began to fall, and Miss Marple sat alone in her parlour watching the droplets streak down the window panes. The case was essentially solved, the murderer identified and arrested, and justice would take its course through the machinery of law and punishment. Yet, Miss Marple reflected, there was something profoundly unsatisfying about the resolution. The truth was that everyone involved, Richard with his weakness and infidelity, Eleanor with her desperate romanticism, Margaret with her misguided maternal instinct, and Caroline with her calculating ruthlessness, had contributed to the tragic outcome. There were no innocent parties, only varying degrees of culpability, and the death of Gerald Whitmore served not as an end point, but as a revelation of the darker currents that flowed beneath the surface of village life. The trial of Caroline Thornton took place 3 months later at the assizes in the county town, and it became the subject of considerable public attention, not merely because of the sensational nature of the crime, but because Caroline's defense counsel attempted to argue that she had been driven to murder by the emotional cruelty inflicted upon her by her husband's infidelities and his threatened abandonment. The defense presented evidence of Richard's numerous affairs, his emotional neglect of his wife, and his callous disregard for her well-being, all of which were calculated to elicit sympathy from the jury, and to suggest that Caroline had acted under the influence of diminished responsibility, brought about by years of psychological torment. It was a clever strategy, and for several days it seemed as though the jury might be swayed by the argument that Caroline was as much a victim as the perpetrator of violence. But the prosecution, bolstered by the testimony of Inspector Graves and supported by Miss Marple's careful documentation of the premeditation and planning that had gone into the murder, presented a far more compelling narrative. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a verdict of guilty, and Caroline Thornton was sentenced to life imprisonment, a sentence that she received with the same composed expression she had worn throughout the trial. As she was led from the dock, she turned briefly to look at Richard, who sat in the gallery with his face grey with shock and remorse, and her expression contained neither anger nor regret, but only a kind of cold acknowledgement that the game had ended and she had lost. What was perhaps most striking about Caroline's composure was that it seemed to vindicate Miss Marple's original assessment. Caroline Thornton was not a woman driven mad by passion or broken by emotional pain. She was simply a woman who had carefully calculated the cost of her position in society and had determined that the price was too high to pay. When that calculation had proven incorrect, When her plan had been discovered and her guilt exposed, she had accepted the consequences, with the equanimity of someone who understood that she had gambled and lost. In the weeks following the trial, Little Ashford attempted to return to its normal rhythms, though the shadow of the murder and the revelations that had preceded the trial lingered over the village like morning mist that refuses to fully dissipate. The Thornton house at Meadowbrook Hall stood empty, as Richard had departed for London and had not returned, his marriage effectively dissolved even before the formalities of divorce could be completed. Eleanor Hartley, chastened by her experiences but not fundamentally broken by them, continued in her position as art teacher at the village school, though she no longer participated in the social gatherings of the village's elite. She spent her time cultivating a small garden behind her cottage and corresponding with friends from her life before Little Ashford, slowly rebuilding the connect. Ions that had been strained by her obsessive focus on Richard Thornton. Margaret Hartley, meanwhile, seemed to age visibly in the aftermath of the trial, as though the revelation of her own complicity in the circumstances that had led to Gerald's death had drained something essential from her spirit. She rarely left her house and spent most of her time in her garden, working the soil with an intensity that suggested she was attempting to bury something beneath the earth itself. It was on a morning in late autumn, when the leaves were turning gold and red and the air carried the first genuine chill of approaching winter, that Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Margaret Hartley appeared at her cottage door with red-rimmed eyes and an expression of desperate resolve, and she asked to speak with Miss Marple in private. They sat in the parlour with the autumn light streaming through the windows, and Margaret began to speak in a low, urgent voice. "I have decided to leave Little Ashford," she said without preamble. "I cannot continue to live in this village knowing that my actions contributed to a man's death. I have arranged to move to the south coast, where I have a sister who has offered me a home. But before I leave, I wanted to speak with you, because I believe you understand something that others do not understand." Miss Marple waited, her aged hands folded in her lap, her expression neither encouraging nor discouraging. "You understand," Margaret continued, "that I did not act out of malice toward Richard Thornton or anyone else. I was a mother attempting to restore to my daughter what I believed she had lost, and yet that same impulse, that same maternal devotion that I believed was virtuous, created the conditions that allowed a woman to commit murder. I wanted you to know that I understand this, that I accept responsibility for it, and that I will spend the remainder of my life attempting to atone for my blindness and my arrogance." Miss Marple regarded Margaret with an expression of profound compassion. "You are correct in your assessment," she said gently. "Your motivations were not malicious, and yet the consequences of your actions were tragic. But I want you to understand something as well, Mrs. Hartley. The responsibility for Gerald Whitmore's death rests with Caroline Thornton, who chose to commit murder. You created circumstances that made murder possible, yes, but you did not place the poison in the glass. Caroline Thornton did that. She made a choice, a deliberate choice, to take a human life. That choice was hers alone, and the guilt for that choice belongs to her alone." Margaret left the cottage with her shoulders slightly less bowed than when she had entered, and Miss Marple watched her depart with the knowledge that some lessons could only be learned through the experience of profound loss and regret. The human capacity for self-deception Miss Marple had learned over her many years in St. Mary Mead was boundless. People were capable of convincing themselves that actions undertaken from genuine affection could not possibly result in harm, that intentions could somehow neutralize consequences, that love could justify any intrusion into the lives of those they claimed to cherish. The winter that followed was one of the coldest in Little Ashford's recent memory, and it seemed to Miss Marple to carry with it a kind of poetic justice, as though the village itself was experiencing a period of purification through exposure to harsh elements. The sparrows that had sung so cheerfully during the summer months had largely departed for warmer climes, and those that remained seemed to chirp with less enthusiasm, their calls reduced to perfunctory announcements rather than the joyful proclamations of spring. It was due. Ring this cold season that Inspector Graves made an unexpected visit to Miss Marple's cottage, ostensibly to update her on administrative matters related to the trial, but in reality, as she quickly discerned, to seek her counsel on a matter that was troubling him deeply. The inspector sat in her parlor much as he had done many times before, cradling a cup of tea with both hands as though drawing warmth from it, and he began to speak in the measured tones of a man who was grappling with questions of professional and personal ethics. "I have been reviewing the case file," he said, "and I have encountered something that troubles me. When we examined Caroline Thornton's belongings after her arrest, we discovered not only the vial of cyanide, but also a letter written in her own hand that was addressed to Richard Thornton. In this letter, Caroline confessed to the murder and explained her motivations with remarkable clarity. However, the letter was never sent, and it was never entered into evidence at the trial. I have been wrestling with the question of whether I should have disclosed its existence to the defense, as it might have provided additional context for Caroline's state of mind." Miss Marple set down her own teacup with deliberate care. "May I ask," she said quietly, "what prompted you to bring this matter to my attention rather than to your superiors or to the legal authorities?" The inspector looked somewhat uncomfortable. "Because I suspect," he said, "that you have already considered this question and have arrived at a conclusion that you feel should guide my own actions. You have a way of seeing matters from a perspective that encompasses not merely law and procedure but the deeper questions of justice and human nature." Miss Marple rose from her chair and walked to the mantelpiece, where several small ornaments were arranged with careful precision. "The question you are asking me," she said, without turning to face the inspector, "is whether justice is better served by adherence to the letter of the law or by consideration of the fuller context in which a crime occurs. You are asking whether Caroline Thornton's culpability is lessened by an understanding of the emotional circumstances that drove her to murder, and whether the jury should have been permitted to know the contents of a confession that was never intended for their eyes." She turned back to face him. "I will tell you what I believe, Inspector Graves, but I want you to understand that this is merely the opinion of an elderly woman who has spent a lifetime observing human nature, and not a pronouncement of absolute truth. I believe that Caroline Thornton committed murder with full knowledge of what she was doing and with clear intention to accomplish that murder. She was not insane, she was not acting under duress, and she was not driven by passions beyond her control. She was acting from calculation and from a desire to preserve her position in society and in her marriage. That being the case, I believe that her confession, whether entered into evidence or not, would not have fundamentally altered the jury's verdict. She would have been found guilty regardless, because the evidence of premeditation and planning was overwhelming. The inspector seemed to relax slightly. "Then you believe I was correct in not disclosing the letter?" "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that you faced a situation in which the proper course of action was not entirely clear and that you made a decision based on your understanding of justice and procedure. Whether that decision was ultimately correct is a matter upon which reasonable people might disagree. But I would offer this observation. In all my years of observing crime and punishment, I have noticed that the law opera tears best when it operates according to established rules and procedures, even when those rules and procedures sometimes produce results that feel unsatisfying. The moment we begin to decide that some confessions should be disclosed and others should not, that some evidence should be introduced and others withheld, based on our personal judgments about what is fair or right, we begin to undermine the very foundation upon which justice rests." The inspector departed the cottage with a lighter step than when he had arrived, and Miss Marple was left alone with her reflections on the nature of law, justice, and the sometimes irreconcilable tensions between them. She understood that the inspector's question had not really been about the letter at all, but rather about the larger question of whether he had been complicit in the murder of truth for the sake of procedural tidiness. She had attempted to reassure him that he had done no wrong, and yet she was not entirely certain that her reassurance was justified. The truth was that the pursuit of justice in the context of human crime was always a messy, imperfect affair, and those charged with its administration were forced to make countless small decisions, each of which might have vast consequences. What troubled Miss Marple as the winter deepened was not Caroline Thornton's fate. The woman was guilty and had been properly punished, but rather the recognition that the machinery of justice, while it had functioned adequately in this case, might not have functioned at all had the various participants in the drama not been willing to cooperate with its processes. Richard Thornton had confessed, Eleanor had submitted to questioning, and the physical evidence had been preserved and properly analyzed. But what if any one of these elements had been absent? What if Richard had chosen to remain silent? What if Eleanor had possessed less? Scrupulous lawyers who had instructed her to say nothing. What if the cyanide had been disposed of more carefully? The thought that justice in this case had depended so heavily upon the voluntary cooperation of those involved and upon the chance preservation of physical evidence gave Miss Marple considerable pause regarding the actual reliability of the legal system in achieving its intended purposes. By the new year, Little Ashford had largely returned to the surface appearance of normalcy, though those who had been present during the murder and its aftermath carried with them an awareness of depths that had been revealed and could never again be entirely hidden. The village gossip, which had been so virulent during the trial, had begun to move on to fresher scandals. The vicar's son had become engaged to a girl from the neighboring town, the headmistress had announced her retirement after 30 years of service, and the doctor's second wife had been observed displaying a considerable appetite for fine wines and fashionable clothes that suggested the marriage was progressing along predictable lines. It was in this atmosphere of renewed but somewhat fragile normalcy that Miss Marple received a letter from Richard Thornton, forwarded to her through the post office in Little Ashford. The letter, written on expensive paper in a hand that trembled slightly, requested that Miss Marple grant him an audience to discuss matters arising from the trial and its aftermath. Miss Marple, who had developed over the years a considerable intuition regarding the contents of letters before she opened them, invited Richard to call upon her on a specific afternoon in February when the weather had turned slightly less severe and the first crocuses were beginning to emerge from the frozen ground. Richard arrived punctually, his appearance altered by the events of the preceding months in ways that went beyond the merely physical. He had aged visibly, lines appearing around his eyes and mouth that had not been present before, and there was a quality of deliberate restraint in his movements and his speech that suggested a man who had been forced to confront truths about himself that he had spent most of his life avoiding. He seated himself in the parlor with the careful movements of someone still unaccustomed to the simple act of existing in space. And for several moments he simply stared at his hands as though they belonged to someone else. "I have come to thank you," he said finally, "for exposing my wife's crime and preventing Eleanor Hartley from being condemned for a murder she did not commit. I recognize that without your intervention, Eleanor would likely have been convicted and imprisoned for a crime orchestrated by Caroline. My wife's guilt would perhaps never have been established, and an innocent woman would have suffered for Caroline's ruthlessness." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, but she said nothing, waiting for Richard to continue. "But I have also come," he continued, his voice becoming quieter, "to ask you whether you believe there is such a thing as redemption for someone who has behaved as I have behaved. I have examined my conduct toward Eleanor, toward Caroline, toward my own conscience, and I have found it all wanting. I used Eleanor's feelings to satisfy my own vanity. I was so desperate to feel valued and desired that I encouraged her attentions despite the fact that I was married to another woman. And when my wife told me what she had done, when she explained that she had poisoned a man partly because she felt abandoned by my infidelity, I understood that I bore responsibility for Gerald Whitmore's death as surely as if I had placed the poison in his glass myself." Richard looked up at Miss Marple with eyes that contained genuine anguish and a desperate hope that she might be able to offer him absolution. Miss Marple regarded him with an expression of neither judgment nor condemnation, but rather with the kind of acceptance that comes from having observed human weakness and human strength in equal measure throughout a long life. "I cannot offer you absolution," she said gently, because I am not in a position to grant it. Absolution, if it is to have any meaning at all, must come from within yourself and from whatever you believe, to be the source of moral authority in the universe. But I can tell you what I have learned from a lifetime of observing human behavior, and that is that redemption is not a state one achieves and then possesses permanently. Rather, it is something one must continually work toward through honest self-examination and through the deliberate choice to act with greater integrity in the future than one has acted in the past. She paused, allowing her words to settle into the space between them. "You cannot undo the harm you have caused," she continued. "Eleanor Hartley will carry the scars of her infatuation with you for some time, and perhaps for the rest of her life. Gerald Whitmore is dead, and no amount of remorse on your part will restore him to life. Caroline Thornton is imprisoned, and her imprisonment, while just, has not erased the suffering she inflicted. But you can choose, from this point forward, to live in a way that acknowledges the consequences of your actions and that attempts, insofar as it is possible, to minimize the harm you cause to others." Richard sat in silence for a long moment. Then he rose from his chair and walked to the window, where he could see Miss Marple's garden beginning its slow awakening from winter sleep. "I have decided," he said, without turning to face her, "to leave England for a time. I have accepted a position with a textile firm in India, work that will keep me occupied and will distance me from the places and people who bear witness to my failures. I thought this was cowardice at first, running away from the consequences of my actions, but I have come to believe that it might be a form of mercy, both to myself and to those I have wronged. If I remain in Little Ashford or in London, I will be a constant reminder to Eleanor of her foolishness and to Caroline of her crimes. Perhaps absence will allow them to begin to move forward with their lives." Miss Marple did not attempt to dissuade him from this course of action. She understood that Richard Thornton was in the process of constructing a narrative for himself that would allow him to live with the knowledge of his complicity in Gerald Whitmore's death, and that this narrative of exile and service might indeed represent the closest he could come to genuine redemption, given the circumstances in which he found himself. As he departed her cottage, promising to write occasionally and to support Eleanor Hartley financially from a distance, Miss Marple reflected that the murder of Gerald Whitmore had set in motion a series of consequences that would ripple through the lives of those involved for years to come, transforming each of them in ways both visible and invisible, breaking some and perhaps, with grace and effort, allowing others to rebuild themselves according to new and more honest designs. Spring came early to Little Ashford that year, and by the time the Easter holidays had arrived, the village had settled into a rhythm that bore only superficial resemblance to the life it had known before Gerald Whitmore's death. The visible scars of the tragedy had largely healed. Meadowbrook Hall had been leased to a family from London who cared nothing of its recent history. The Thornton name appeared less frequently in the village gossip, and those who had been most directly affected by the murder had either departed for new lives elsewhere or had learned to present a facade of normalcy that was convincing enough for casual observation. Yet beneath this surface of restored tranquility, Miss Marple understood that something fundamental had shifted in the moral landscape of the village. The collective consciousness of Little Ashford had been confronted with evidence that evil could flourish in respectable homes, that those of elevated social station were as capable of moral corruption as anyone else, and that the careful social hierarchies and established proprieties that had seemed to provide order and safety were in fact no such thing. It was on a morning in late April, when the wisteria was beginning to bloom in Miss Marple's garden with the same profusion it had displayed the day of the murder, that Eleanor Hartley came to call upon her. Eleanor had changed considerably in the months since the trial, though whether the change represented genuine transformation or merely the adoption of a new performance was difficult to determine. She was quieter now, less inclined toward the theatrical displays of emotion that had characterized her before, and she carried herself with a kind of dignity that suggested she had learned something valuable from her ordeal, even if that learning had been purchased at considerable cost. She brought with her a small watercolor painting executed in soft grays and pale blues, depicting the view from her cottage window toward the church and the surrounding countryside. "I wanted to give you this," Eleanor said, presenting the painting to Miss Marple with an expression of genuine gratitude as a token of my appreciation for your kindness and your wisdom. You did not judge me, even when I had given you considerable cause to do so. You saw beyond my foolishness to the person Bene, Ath, and you treated me with a respect that I did not believe I deserved." Miss Marple accepted the painting with pleasure, recognizing immediately that Eleanor had regained the artistic skill that had been temporarily overwhelmed by her emotional turmoil. The painting was executed with genuine sensitivity and technical competence, and it suggested that Eleanor was beginning to channel her energies into more productive and less destructive pursuits. "You have given me no reason to judge you," Miss Marple replied. "You were a young woman who made choices that were unwise but not malicious. You have learned from those choices, and you have begun to rebuild your life on firmer foundations. That is all anyone can reasonably ask of themselves." Eleanor stayed for tea, and as they sat in the parlor with the afternoon light streaming through the windows, they discussed Eleanor's plans for the future. She had decided to remain in Little Ashford, despite the painful associations the village held for her, because she believed that to flee would be to suggest that she was unable to face the consequences of her actions. She had also begun to take on private students in art, supplementing her income from the school and creating opportunities to work with young people in contexts that allowed for greater flexibility and personal attention. Most significantly, she had begun correspondence with a distant cousin who lived in Scotland, a man approximately her own age who shared her passion for artistic pursuits and who had written to her with genuine interest and respect that seemed to be untainted by the kind of emotional manipulation that had characterized Richard Thornton's attentions. "I am not," Eleanor said with a smile that contained both sadness and hope, "rushing into anything. I have learned that lesson, at least. But it is pleasant to correspond with someone who seems to value me for myself rather than for what I can provide to them emotionally or otherwise." After Eleanor departed, Miss Marple spent the remainder of the afternoon in her garden, tending to the plants and reflecting on the manner in which the human capacity for growth and change was often underestimated. People, she had found, possessed within themselves far greater reserves of resilience and wisdom than they generally credited themselves with possessing. Eleanor Hartley, given time and the opportunity for reflection, had extracted something valuable from the experience of her humiliation and disappointment. She had emerged from the crisis not unscathed, but genuinely wiser, and that wisdom would serve her well in whatever life lay ahead. It was as the sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the garden and painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, that Miss Marple experienced what might best be described as a moment of philosophical clarity. The murder of Gerald Whitmore, viewed from the perspective of several months' distance, appeared less as a singular dramatic event and more as a natural consequence of the interactions and relationships that had been developing in Little Ashford over the preceding years. Caroline Thornton had not woken up one morning and decided to commit murder, rather. She had arrived at that decision through a series of small choices, each of which had seemed reasonable or justified at the moment it was made, but which in aggregate had led her inexorably toward the commission of a terrible crime. The tragedy of human existence, Miss Marple reflected, was not that people were capable of evil, but that they arrived at evil through paths that seemed, from their own perspective, to be justified by circumstances and by the actions of others. This was not an excuse for Caroline's crime, nor was it an absolute. But it was an understanding that extended her moral vision beyond simple condemnation and into the realm of genuine tragedy, where good people, responding to painful circumstances in human ways, sometimes found themselves complicit in outcomes that horrified them. As the light faded from the garden and Miss Marple prepared to retire indoors for the evening, she allowed herself a small reflection on the case as a whole. She had been correct in her deductions, had identified the guilty party, and had ensured that justice, insofar as justice could be achieved through the legal system, had been served. and yet she did not feel the satisfaction that might have been expected to accompany the successful resolution of a difficult mystery. Instead, she felt something closer to sorrow, a recognition that the truth, once revealed, had not made the world better, had not prevented suffering, and had merely confirmed what she had known for many years, that human nature was complex, that goodness and evil were often indistinguishably intermingled, and that the best one could hope for was to navigate one's way through life with as much wisdom and compassion as one could muster.